We've witnessed increasing severity of storms, stronger hurricanes, blizzards in the spring, 50-year floods, and droughts expanding. The argument over climate change has been heating up the last few years. Is the human population responsible? What do we do, if anything, and is it even real? Climate change. Those two words launch a political firestorm. On one side, it's an immediate threat, a call to action with knee-jerk policies and outrageous constraints. On the other side, it's a denial of its existence, a non-issue that's continually mocked and panned. Well, newsflash, it's true. Climate change does exist. It's not just weather patterns changing over time, and human activity is responsible for the increased warming since the Industrial Revolution. But we shouldn't have to jump through hoops to try and stop it, if it's even possible. The denial of climate change and global warming, despite the copious amount of supporting evidence and visual verification of retreating glaciers, rising ocean levels, and shrinking ice sheets. It's on par with believing that the Earth is flat. And continuing to overlook it is a product of partisan division and disliking or disagreeing with something completely based on who supports it. 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is occurring and driven by human activity. That's better than the 9 out of 10 dentists who prefer a certain toothpaste, and about the same percentage of the effectiveness of condoms, for what that's worth. And there are times where you should question the validity of scientific reports. Those are usually claims that are so outrageous it should trigger some common sense alarm. And in those cases, it would be smart to follow the money. Well, the 97% of scientists who support the evidence of climate change usually report their independent studies and findings in an educational environment and have no affiliation to any government. The 3% of scientists who deny climate change, well, they tend to be funded by no surprises, the energy industry. Thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, it was discovered that ExxonMobil, Southern Company, the American Petroleum Institute, and a foundation run by the Koch brothers provided up to $1.25 million for scientists to provide dissenting or even misleading information on climate change. This is just about the same as the use of doctors in the past to have them support health advantages of cigarette smoking. So what does the actual science say about climate change? And no, I'm not a scientist, but I defer to their lifelong dedication to their studies. Yes, historically, Earth's climate is in a continuous flux. There have been 7 notable cycles of glacial advance and retreat just over the past 650,000 years, and we've been in our current modern climate for less than 12,000 years. So, with these natural fluctuations, how do we know that human action is the cause for the rapid increase in global temperature? Well, we know that of all the gases that collect in our atmosphere, carbon dioxide is the largest culprit for trapping heat. There are other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is the kingpin. And by measuring ice core samples, tree rings, coral reefs, ocean sediments, and many other metrics, we can definitively show the recent rapid progression of CO2 in our atmosphere by more than 250 times the natural emissions of our paleoclimate before us from things like volcanoes. But again, how do we know that CO2 is from human activity? Well, That's where it's interesting. We have the ability to differentiate types of CO2 between naturally occurring or manufactured. And with this understanding and comparing it to past samples, it's pretty clear cut that human activity has added to the increase in global temperature with our CO2 emissions. So what can we do? Well, for starters, we can take ownership of the problem as individuals. Each of us can make small adjustments to reduce carbon emissions. Things like eating less meat to reduce the farming footprint, flying less, walking or bicycling more, weatherizing your home, or even using public transportation. But some of those do not sound desirable. And that's why it should be an individual choice and not a requirement. And that's where a more favorable education and outreach may help ease hesitation, instead of the dire and doom message touted by the left today. What about the government? Should they get involved? Yes and no. We've seen an ambitious multi-trillion-dollar Green New Deal be brought up by some members of Congress. This would essentially direct the US to be carbon neutral or net zero carbon emissions within 10 years. But with a national debt recently surpassing $30 trillion and inflation continuing to be an issue, a bill that has been projected as high as $100 trillion or even at its lowest of $18 trillion would almost certainly overburden taxpayers. And if we really want to reduce the impact of climate change, we're going to need a strong economy. And because of that, the major concern for any government, especially here in the US, should be energy independence. We should not be deterred by the natural progression of technology, and neither should the government. So, as green fuels become affordable and efficient, there's no reason businesses and governments shouldn't transition. But those renewable energies are not as efficient or even cost-effective as we would hope. Traditional fossil fuels still have a place in society today. And there have also been technological advancements on emission capture and reduction technology. And these measures should be incentivized with government support until those renewable sources can compete for efficiency. Because as great as renewable energy sources are, solar power still requires the sun, wind turbines need gusts, and water generators need flow. And Mother Nature isn't necessarily reliable. When these sources are unavailable, which is 60 to 75% of the time, fossil fuels are required as backup. And even they aren't completely reliable, as they are subject to fuel cost and seasonal variation in demand. And there are negative environmental impacts from green fuels that tend to go unnoticed. Solar requires an enormous footprint, which means deforestation. A gas-fired generator that produces 1,300 kilowatts of power takes up 39 acres. For solar to provide that same amount of energy, it would require 36,000 acres, or 56 square miles. That's roughly the size of Richmond, Virginia. Water power diverts water sources. That could cause a disruption of ecosystems. And wind turbines need certain land-based requirements that are typically remote and far from population, meaning hundreds of miles of transmission lines need to be built and maintained. I don't mean to sound anti-green energy because I do support renewables, as we all should. I'm just pointing out the disadvantages of those sources as of today. And if they only work 25% of the time, great. That's still 25% less emissions. So we need to be responsible and advance in transitioning to green fuels, but also be wary of disrupting our energy independence. There is an alternative that significantly reduces greenhouse emissions, is extremely effective and efficient, requires very little footprint, is the most reliable of all energy sources, strengthens our energy independence, and releases less radiation into the environment than any other major energy source. You thought I was going to say nuclear until that less radiation statement, right? Well, surprise, it is nuclear energy. And all of those points still apply, even the fact that it emits less radiation. Nuclear energy is our answer, period. It would provide all the advantages of reducing carbon emissions to zero while providing all of our energy requirements. The problem with nuclear isn't the dangers, but the perception. Since 1945, the immense raw and destructive power of what atomic energy can do has manipulated our opinion as the only outcome of its existence. And with disasters like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, it seems to only reinforce those stigmas. We have learned and updated technology and safety measures since the events of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. And the most recent disaster at Fukushima wasn't the result of human failure, but natural disaster. Though it could be argued that it was poorly placed near a fault line and susceptible to tsunamis. But dozens of other nuclear power plants have endured earthquakes, even during the one in 2011, and have survived unfazed due to the valuable safety technologies and measures put in place. The other major negative perception of nuclear energy is its waste. And thanks to generations growing up watching Blinky, nuclear waste has become the go-to argument for its negative impact on the environment. But the technology for the reuse, transport, long-term storage, and disposal are already established. And less than 3% of all nuclear waste, known as high-level waste, is radioactive. With places like France, who've embraced nuclear power, they've reduced that type to 0.2%. The radioactivity diminishes over time, and we have developed completely safe, secure, and impenetrable steel and concrete casks. The only major problem with nuclear power isn't of technological concern, but a political problem. And though we have nuclear power plants in America already, they provide less than 20% of our energy. And there is no major push to expand or even acknowledge the efficiency nuclear energy provides. Climate change is a very real threat, and global warming cannot be ignored. But we have to be cognizant in our efforts to maintain energy independence and not bog down our economy while transitioning to sustainable green energy. Renewable energy is not as efficient or reliable as we'd like yet. And until the technology catches up with our desires for clean, sustainable energy, nuclear power provides the single most reliable, sustainable, and clean source we have available now. If you're really serious about reducing the human impact of climate change, open your mind to nuclear energy, and it has the added benefit of securing our energy independence.